Okay, so now we're going to be talking about versioning and documenting your automations. And this becomes very important as you start to get up into the tens of automations. You may have built maybe a dozen or so automations. When you get to like 20 or 30, then it starts to become more important to have really good documentation and versioning of what you're doing. Particularly if you've got multiple people working in your automation system, you want to make sure that you're documenting any changes, and you also want to make sure that you've documented what does what, so that if something breaks or if something needs to be changed in the future, then you can find it fairly easily and painlessly. There's nothing worse than coming into an automation platform that someone else has built where there's absolutely no documentation and all you have to do is kind of guess based on the scenario names. That makes my job when I come in to do that extremely difficult to do. And for any other developer that comes in, it will be the same. So if you're thinking about bringing in a developer, or you're at the stage where you've got 20 or 30 different scenarios, then it's really time to create a versioning and documentation table. Now, I've seen multiple ways of doing this. People have created mud maps on things like Lucidchart and diagrams.net. I prefer a table layout just because it's a lot easier to see all the data in one place. But if you're a visual person, then maybe you might want to have a mud map on top of that. I would still keep with a table layout as it has some strong advantages, such as being able to pull in all the scenarios via an API, which is what I've just done here. And if you're interested in doing that, so this just pulled in 192 active automations in this account currently. I built a very simple automation here, which I'll attach to the course as a download. Essentially, it just lists all the automations in an account, and then it will just look up your, in this case, Airtable database to see if it already has that scenario listed, and then it will just update or create it in this module here. Now, you can add a lot of integrations and extra data, etc., if you want to sort of store them in your Airtable base or some other sort of database for logging data. If you want to log data for some long-term data of maybe get an overtime use of the operations and the data, well, that's something that you can do with the Make API. To do that, you would have to log that over a period of time, because when you're searching the API, there's a limit to how much data you can get. And for example, this one here of getting blueprint versions, they only store and allow you to access up to 60 days worth of previous versions for each scenario. So there are some limitations in how much data you can get, which if you want to have a long historical database, well, you're just going to have to search it and log it every month or so, and then you'll build up that 1 year data bank that you want. So now we've essentially got our list of scenarios here. Now you could also bring in whether the scenario is on or off. You could also have a fully functioning button that would also turn the scenario on or off here. You could also bring in a list of connections, which would be the same as your make.com connections. For me, those sort of things are nice to haves. They're probably not going to be used that much. I prefer just to know what apps are in my scenarios. And so I really, on the bare basics, you just need a name. You need a brief description, which might be, scenario is for sending a makeup confirmation to the customer and also to the outsourced person that does the makeup, right? That's the brief description there. Then you may also choose to add a trigger. And this could be a single select dropdown or a text field. And the trigger is essentially, well, how is this automation started? So if we look at this automation here, it's probably triggered from a webhook. This webhook is coming from ActiveCampaign. And so I might write the trigger here of ActiveCampaign, and then I might even put in the automation in ActiveCampaign that triggers this scenario, just so that when I come back to it 6 to 12 months later, I'm going to have all the information I need, so I don't have to go searching for it and figuring out, what I need to change and where it is. So description, trigger, they're definitely some important fields. The link to the scenario, that's obviously an important one. And then the apps, I would just simply list out, Airtable, ActiveCampaign, and Gmail here. So we just put in Gmail, Airtable, and I've got a single select. I need multi-select. So Airtable, ActiveCampaign, and Gmail. So that's essentially listing out the apps. Now, the benefit of doing something like this in Airtable is if, for instance, you had a Gmail, one of your Gmail modules broke or the connection broke, something like that, well, you could do a filter here and just go, right, everything that contains the app of Gmail, I want to basically filter my scenarios to show me that data, right? And so we'll just do a nice, Airtable's great at doing those sort of filtered views, and it's a great use case for that. You can do similar things in Coda and ClickUp and Smartsheets. So any of those platforms will allow you to do that. Even Google Sheets, you can do that with the filters. You could also do something like contains the keyword of triggered from ActiveCampaign, right? And so then if you're looking for all your scenarios that are triggered using ActiveCampaign, well, you could have that as either a trigger dropdown or maybe even a keyword within the filter of trigger. And you could just put in ActiveCampaign, and then it will filter to all the ones that you've mentioned ActiveCampaign as the trigger. Obviously, you'd have to get spelling right and all that for that to work. That's the benefit of option sets. You can just pick them from the list. So that's one of the reasons why we document it, so that we can find things easily when things change, because you might 6 months from now decide that you don't want to use ActiveCampaign and you want to use ConvertKit. So now you have to find everything that uses ActiveCampaign, convert it over to ConvertKit, and it may not be obvious 6 months from now that these scenarios use ActiveCampaign. Right, for this particular example, we do have an ActiveCampaign module here, which means it will show up if we search for ActiveCampaign in the scenarios. But if we didn't have that module, this webhook is still coming from ActiveCampaign. So unless I've got something in the name of the scenario, or I just remember that that's coming from ActiveCampaign, or I go through all the ActiveCampaign automations and I see there's webhooks being sent, and then I have to find, from those webhooks what do they trigger and all that sort of stuff. It creates a lot of unnecessary work if there's no documentation. So keeping things documented just keeps your head screwed on and makes your job a lot easier. Now, I normally also include a very short Loom video explaining what that scenario does. And that's more so for if you've got someone on your team building these automations for you and your team, then you want them to just do a quick 1 to even 30-second Loom video doing a very brief explanation of what's happening right after they've built this scenario and they've finished testing it. And the benefit there is, well, now 6 months' time, that person, the developer, or even yourself, or a new developer, can come in, they can watch that Loom, and in 30 seconds to a minute, they already know exactly what this scenario is doing. They know what's triggering it. They know the thought process behind all the different logic in here. And it's, within 1 minute of watching a video, they've understood what that scenario is built for and what it's integrated with, versus having to read through all the documentation, the descriptions, click all the links to open up all the things and, get into the microscope of it. The Loom video is just a real quick, easy way to communicate. Then I also like to put in here a last checked date field. Now, the benefit of this field is that if you watch the previous module about deployment, it's important that we follow up on our scenarios and that we check them routinely, every 3 months, every 6 months, every week if they're really important, and just make sure they're still functioning and working correctly. Well, this last checked field is a great way to keep track of when you last checked that this scenario was working. And Airtable's great here because you can just do a bulk paste and update multiple fields all at the same time if you check all of them at once. And then with your filters, you could create a filtered view here if you wanted to, and you could put in the filtered view everything that was last checked is before, say 10 days from today, right? Or yeah, I think these are all on the future date, but you know, you can have a view that basically filters these out for things that you haven't looked at for at least 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, etc. You could even add logic into Airtable to filter them based on when you wanted to check them, you know, what interval of time did you want to check them on, and then add different views for filtering those. Then we've got the scenario ID. Now the scenario ID is really just used for connecting your scenario here so that you can run this. I would normally just set this to a scheduled run, maybe once a week, once a month, if you're not creating a whole bunch of the automations all the time. And that way it will just keep this list updated. And then in the views, you may have a view of needs, description, and you just filter that to description field as blank, or needs information, and then you just maybe have a checkbox here for when all the basic information has been added, right? So you can create a little mini process here to keep things organized. So that's the documentation side of it. You don't really need to get any more involved than this. I've seen people create entire Google Docs and Evernotes where they've screenshot everything, and it's like 10 pages of documentation for like a scenario like this, right? And that's, if you feel like you need to do that, fine. But honestly, that's just way too much documentation. If a developer came in and he saw that, or they saw that, they're not going to read through 10 pages of documentation when they could understand it in literally 4 or 5 minutes by just looking at it here, right? So whenever you're writing documentation, you have to be mindful of how much time is involved in creating that and how much time is involved in actually reading and understanding that documentation. Is it hindering understanding what this thing is, or is it helping the person understand what this thing is? And that's really the cutoff point for when you know that you've added too much or too little to your documentation. And to really know what that point is, it's usually, if you really want to get good at it, you'd want to write the documentation and then pass it off to somebody else to see if they understand everything that's in there. Now, for this, that's probably a little over the top. You just need some basic documentation. You don't need to write a full procedure for these things. Now, the other thing is the versioning. Now, with versioning in particular, when we save a scenario in make.com, we have the opportunity to roll back to previous versions. So these are previous saves of this scenario. Now we can click on a previous version, load that up, and here's our previous version here. Now, with make.com, you can download up to 60 days worth of blueprint versions. So you can do that with the API here. The downside, though, with this API is it doesn't actually save the JSON. It just says, here's a version, and doesn't actually give you the data for that to restore that version, right? If you wanted to restore it, well, you'd have to go back into make.com, and in make.com, it's only going to be listed here in the previous versions if it is within the last 60 days, right? If you want something that's not within the last 60 days, well, you're stuffed, right? Unless you've saved a version of it somewhere, you can't roll back to it. So normally when I first start editing a scenario that I haven't touched before, haven't touched for a long time, the first thing I do is I open the scenario up and I hit save. I just go, yep, save, create a save point, create a version of that scenario before I touch anything in it. Now, that allows me to then have a version here that I can roll back to from when I first looked at that scenario. Then I might go ahead and, edit it, save it a few times, and now I've got my list of versions and I can jump around between those versions if I need to. But I've always got that first saved version. And it's quite common that people won't do that first saved version. You have to really sort of get into the habit of doing it. And it really sort of stuffs you up later on, because you may spend like half an hour building the scenario or changing it, and then you get to the very end and then you go, oh, that's not going to work, right? And then you go, oh, I've made all these changes and now I have to roll them all back, and I haven't hit save anywhere along this point, and now I've just got to either close the tab and hope that it goes back to the old version. You get all these sort of problems when you don't hit the save button regularly enough. So definitely hit that whilst you're building the scenarios, and that way you're creating versions whilst you're adding on different functions and modules throughout. Now, I would only really click that maybe every 15 minutes or so, 10 minutes as you're building and testing things. And normally every time that I hit run, I always hit save, because when I'm running, it's because I've normally created a new function that I want to test, right? So I want to save at that point. Okay, so that's the versions. Now, how do we restore to a previous version that was before 60 days? Well, that's actually quite simple. So we can export the Blueprint version here, and whatever we're seeing currently, that's what's going to be exported, so the current version. So we can click on export. We get a nice little JSON file here, which is just going to be all JSON code. And essentially this is the visual scenario represented in JSON code. And what we can do with that is we can import that back into this scenario editor, and it will import whatever the scenario was at that point of export. So that allows you to create these historical archives that may be a year old, 90 days old, 10 years old, doesn't matter, unless Make changes their architecture. You can then restore to something that's 5 years ago if you needed to. So we download those records, and then I usually create a versions table here in Airtable, where I might have some sort of brief description about this version, which might be added or changed to Calendly, changed Acuity from Acuity to Calendly, right? That was what we changed when we created this version. And you might have notes in here if I created this, changed this, etc. And you just add in your version here, which will be a JSON file. And the good thing is these JSON files are quite small because they're not holding a lot of data. It looks like a lot when you open it because it's a lot of text, but there's nothing heavy in that will take up a lot of data. So then I'll just add that here, and I could have a created date if I wanted to, or I could maybe put a custom date field in here. So we'll just say version date. And that way I know when I created this, we'll say on the 13th, and then we'll have maybe another one which we might call the original version, right? So the original launch, something like that. And that will be our version here. And then we'll just link that to the same automation, and we'll say that one was, the week before. So now when we're looking at our automations, we'll also have a list of available versions, and these versions, we have our JSON there ready to go so that we can import that and restore from that particular version. Now, versioning is important if you've got a very complex scenario. This one here is quite simple, so it wouldn't take that long to rebuild, maybe 15 minutes, half an hour to figure out all the logic and all the mappings and what's happening where. So it's not a huge loss if we happen to delete that one. And this versioning also protects you from malicious intent. Someone, maybe a disgruntled employee or something, gets into your make, decides to delete everything, right? Now they've deleted 6 months or 12 months of development work, and once it's deleted, there's no way to roll it back, right? Not unless you contact Make, and you're lucky if they roll it back for you. So having this away in another system allows you to have those backups. I know a lot of people get quite nervous having their entire business running through Make or even Zapier or any other sort of platform like that. And this gives you a lot of peace of mind, right? So if we look at this scenario here, this one here is quite a big, complex scenario. It's been changed over and over and over again for the last 2-3 years. And a recent change we did was we replaced the Cutly link, the Cutly link shortener, and before that it was a Bitly link shortener. So we replaced Bitly with Cutly, and then we replaced Cutly with CapsuLink. So we've replaced this particular part in this scenario multiple times. And so that would be a really good thing to create a version of, because we may be using CapsuLink now, but then 6 months down the line, we may want to roll back to Bitly because they changed their pricing and now they're much better than CapsuLink, right? So little things like that will allow you to sort of switch between different things as you're changing them. But this particular one, this is definitely one that I would want to create versions for, because there's just so much in here, right? This is probably a good 2 hours, if not 3 hours of development that has happened over the course of maybe 3 to 6 months for this particular scenario. And it might have started with just one call type up the top here. And that might have only been maybe a half hour, 45-minute build out, right? And then we added in a couple more call types, and there's filters in here and logic, and it's a whole lot of thinking and emails back and forth and conversations. And this is something that you really want to capture in a version and put into a database table like this. So if you've got complicated scenarios like that, I definitely recommend creating versions. If you've got multiple people working in your systems, versions are definitely useful there as well. And if you happen to possibly need to roll back to previous, 6 months, 9-month versions, then you definitely need to have your own version database and not rely on make.com. But in terms of documentation and versioning, this will be enough for, I would say, 95, 98% of you. You really don't need to get any more complicated than an Airtable table with just a list of your scenarios and just some basic details about them. That's really all you need in here.